Charles Dickens is one of the best-known writers in the world and is considered to be the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. If you live in an English-speaking country, you've probably read Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, and A Christmas Carol in school. His work became so popular it even sparked the creation of the word Dickensian to describe his style. So why is Charles Dickens' work considered to be so good that it has inspired future generations, and who was the man who created all of these well-known characters? Well, in today's Biographics, you're gonna find out. Not a big surprise. Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 in Portsmouth, England, to John and Elizabeth Dickens. He was one of just 8 children, and 2 of his siblings died at a very young age. Throughout his childhood, young Charles loved to play outside, and he read as many books as he possibly could. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, which meant that he guarded money in a safe and handed out paychecks to sailors. The Navy would often move him from place to place whenever it was necessary. So, as a boy, Charles was able to live in several different areas in England. John Dickens, he was a very ambitious man and hoped to climb the ranks at his job. Eventually, he was able to move the family to London and pay for Charles to get a private education. Once he was living in the big city, Charles was exposed to performances from the local theatre, and he became inspired by the actors and would jump up on the tables of the local pub and sing and dance. He also performed plays with his siblings and imagined that he would grow up to become an actor. His father, John, was optimistic and did not prescribe to the old-fashioned notion that people are born in the place where they are supposed to stay throughout their lives. He taught all of his children that they could be rich if they worked hard enough. One day, while walking with Charles, he pointed to a mansion called Gads Hill Place, saying that if he worked hard, he could own a house like that someday. Even though John Dickens was a hard worker and an excellent father, he made the mistake of spending his money before he could really make it. With so many children and a wife to take care of, he often lived beyond his means. His father struggled so much with money that Charles Dickens had to leave school to work in a blacking polish factory at just 12 years old. He had the tedious task of gluing labels to bottles for 11 hours a day, making only 6 shillings per week. Even though today would be like, this is totally child labor, back in the day, totally cool. Charles was actually lucky to have found that job though, because his father ended up in debtor's prison. Charles owed £40 and 6 shillings, and the only way that he could get out of jail was to pay back that debt. But obviously, if he was not allowed to work or earn money in prison, he would never be released. The entire Dickens family had to move into the prison with him, even the young children, because there was nowhere else for them to live. Since 12-year-old Charles was the only one who actually had a job, he could afford to rent a room that was just big enough for himself, and the responsibility of freeing his entire family, it then fell on his small shoulders. Charles visited his family every Sunday and helped them in any way that he could. However, since he only made 6 shillings per week, there was not much that the poor boy could do. Fortunately, John Dickens was able to inherit some money from his mother, and he paid off his debt in full. Even though he had to endure this lifestyle for a year and he was eventually able to return to school, this deeply affected Charles Dickens for the rest of his life. They had been fortunate enough to receive the inheritance to save the family just in time, but what about the people who were not so lucky? Charles realized that even well-to-do families that were full of good people like his, they could fall on hard times. Years later, this would inspire stories like Oliver Twist and Little Dorrit. At 15 years old, Charles became a junior law clerk for an attorney, and he began to learn to write shorthand. While he worked at the firm, he would pay attention to the clients who were coming in and looking for legal advice. He often wrote down their physical descriptions and mannerisms and wrote stories about them. Charles had a knack for finding humor in even the most awful of situations and would often laugh at some of the issues that people were complaining about. It was just the beginning of his fascination with true crime, as well as his ability to write about difficult topics with a bit of a sense of humor. Now that he was growing up and had more experience in the workforce, Charles Dickens tried to go after his dream of becoming an actor. When he was 20 years old, he had an audition for a play in Covent Garden, but he came down with a terrible cold and had to miss his appointment. He was never given another chance. Now, at the time, this must have seemed like a horrible setback because this had been his lifelong dream. But if he had become an actor, he would have never fulfilled his destiny of becoming a great writer. He eventually moved on from becoming a law clerk and became a journalist at the Morning Chronicle. Even at the paper, he was still interested in law and sat through court cases at the House of Commons to report on what had happened. This is actually where he met the daughter of his editor, Catherine Hogarth. After only knowing one another for 3 months, Charles proposed and they were married in 1836. They would go on to have 10 children throughout the course of their marriage. Through his writing, Charles Dickens paints the Victorian era as a time that was dirty, dark, and crude, especially for those who were living in the lower class. While some of his social commentary is very critical, it's clear that he truly did love England, and he wanted it to be better. He felt the best way that he could help was to write stories that put a spotlight on social and political issues. It wasn't all dark, of course. Dickens also wrote touching scenes where people could enjoy the simple things in life, like a warm fire, a good story, and spending time with family. In fact, his story, A Christmas Carol, is credited for capturing all of England's best holiday traditions, and it still warms people's hearts to this very day. In all of his stories, there was always an underlying moral lesson, and one of the first issues he decided to tackle was the treatment of the poor. The beginning of the Victorian era was at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and it was now more necessary than ever to get cheap labour into factories if the country wanted to move forward with its economic progress. When Charles was 22 years old, the 1834 Poor Law made it a rule that if anyone was living on the street, they were taken to live in a workhouse. Children were educated while the parents would work several hours a day in exchange for food and shelter. This caused a huge amount of debate because workhouses were essentially prisons just for poor people. Once they entered a workhouse, there was simply no escape. Everyone knew that life in the workhouse was awful, but people in the upper class were taught that poverty, it was someone's own fault. Any harsh treatment, it was necessary because they deserved it. As someone who grew up suffering through poverty, Charles Dickens knew that good, hard-working people could sometimes fall on hard times, and that doesn't mean that they should be thrown in a workhouse. It was clear to him that the lawmakers from the upper class were out of touch with reality and totally lacked empathy for people in the working class. It became his mission to change the hearts and the minds of the people of England. He knew two very important things that set him apart from other writers. Firstly, no one liked being lectured to. Second is that his audience would never care about anything unless it had something to do with them. So Dickens, he had to figure out a way to make a story entertaining first and almost hide his moral lessons within the context of the story. He would also incorporate people in the middle to upper classes and show that even having a privileged birth does not necessarily mean that you are immune to hardship. When he was 24 years old, he began publishing his stories in serialized form. These were the Pickwick Papers, which was a satire based on real-life political corruption. At first, the stories, they were not so successful, and Dickens was only earning £14 per month. But after the fourth issue was published, it became a huge hit, and sales of his serial went from 400 to 40,000 copies per month. The fact that his work was serialized a few chapters at a time rather than releasing a novel all at once was actually a huge benefit to him. His fans would speculate what was going to happen next, just like someone would do when they're watching a TV series in modern times. People were so excited to talk about the stories to their friends that it soon spread by word of mouth. Soon the name Charles Dickens was being mentioned all over London, and he became a bit of a celebrity writer. At age 25, Dickens would publish his serialized story called Oliver Twist, which shows what life was truly like for a child living in the workhouse. The main character, Oliver, was born into a well-to-do family, and he had the misfortune of getting lost and ending up in the workhouse. Readers were able to think, what if this happened to me? He was sure to make the stories humorous and easy for anyone to read. More and more people began to have empathy for the poor and understand that something needed to be changed. This was years before the internet, of course, so the only way Charles Dickens could do his research about the biggest social issues throughout England was to act like a reporter and travel to locations in person. When he heard that young boys were being abused in orphanages, he took a 2-day carriage journey to visit one so that he could have a first-hand account of what was truly going on. This inspired his story, Nickleby. He also visited inside insane asylums to witness the mistreatment of people with mental illnesses and often walked through some of the worst parts of London. So you might now be thinking, wait, what? So Charles Dickens just showed up, watched people who were being abused, and never did anything except write a book? Well, the thing is, Dickens never claimed to have all of the solutions to the problems in society, and with his experience sitting as a reporter in court, he knew that changing a law was a complicated ordeal. All he could do was simply observe and write stories about the truth. This alone was enough for people to talk about the issues and begin to have empathy for the downtrodden. Everyone wanted their country to be better. In that way, there has perhaps been no other man alive who has done so much for social reform in the United Kingdom than Charles Dickens. Even though Charles Dickens was never able to fulfill his childhood dream of becoming a professional actor, he decided to try becoming a showman. In 1842, Charles and his wife Catherine decided to travel to the United States together so that he could give public readings of his works. At the time, books were one of the main forms of entertainment, so the idea of a favorite author coming to town was like a rock star going on tour. Dickens insisted that tickets should be discounted for working-class people, and he spoke to sold-out theaters every time. People who witnessed his readings described how passionately he would read in the voices of each of his characters, and that no other performance of his works would ever rival the author. In 1844 to 1845, he spent time living in Italy and Switzerland, doing public speaking engagements and writing a few more books. By 1847, he had earned a substantial amount of money from his tour, and he was finally able to invest some of that money into actually helping people. At the time, there were very few job opportunities and childcare options for women. Their only option was to get married and find a man who could take care of them. And if they fell on hard times, they had no choice but to become fallen women or sex workers. If they were arrested, many of these women were sent to Magdalen Hospitals, yes, like Mary Magdalene from the Bible. They were constantly told they were an awful person and they were punished harshly for their sins. The only other option for an uneducated woman besides the life of a sex worker would be to live in the workhouse, which was essentially going to prison. At least with sex work, they maintained some freedom. Charles Dickens knew that many of these women did not deserve to be in this situation, and many would be able to turn their lives around if only they were given a place to stay and get their life together. He founded the Home for Homeless Women at Urania College. The women who lived here were taught skills that would get them jobs, and of course he would also interview them to hear their life stories, and he was able to draw inspiration from them for his future works. In March of 1856, Dickens was 44 years old when he learns that the mansion he had dreamed of as a child, Gads Hill Place, was up for sale. He purchased the home for £1,790. At the time, he had let go of his childish wonder of the place and thought that at the very least it might make a good investment and he would rent it out. But once he saw it in person again, he truly loved the home, and it reminded him of what had inspired him to work so hard so long ago. He kept it as his country house, and it became a welcome escape from the city. It was around this time that Charles Dickens was beginning to have a bit of a crisis. He was at the peak of his career, but no longer happy in his marriage with Catherine, and he spent more time throwing large parties at Gads Hill Place. At the time, divorce was totally taboo, especially for a public figure. He had also given himself the reputation of being a pinnacle of morality and had to continue pretending that everything was totally fine. At one of these parties, Dickens invited over the cast of a local theatre as well as celebrity friends like author Hans Christian Andersen. It was around this time in his life when Dickens met a young actress called Ellen Ternan. He was 45, she was only 18. They began having an affair, but he kept their relationship a secret as to not damage their reputations. In 1858, Charles became separated from his wife Catherine. They no longer lived together, but he was forced to stay legally married. During their separation, Charles tried to get a divorce by claiming that his wife was mentally ill. The word soon got out and it caused a public scandal. He wrote 98 letters about his issues with his wife, and they were only recently discovered when they were sold at auction in 2014. This has caused a lot of debate amongst scholars. Some say that Dickens was lying about his wife's mental state and was willing to have her committed to an asylum just so that he could be with Ellen Ternan. Others believe that Catherine truly was sick because this man who had so much love and empathy for other people would never send someone to an asylum if it wasn't necessary. Charles Dickens continued his relationship with Ellen behind closed doors and bought her a house just outside of London so that he could go visit her. The two of them continued their secret affair for 13 years. They had a child together, but he died in infancy and they would never go on to have another. On June 9th, 1865, Charles and Ellen were on a train together when they approached Staplehurst. And fun aside here, everybody, I grew up about 10 minutes from Staplehurst. The tracks were being repaired and the conductor had no idea that it was happening. The conductor hit the brakes, but it was already too late. All of the first-class carriages, they fell into the river below. The one and only first-class car that remained on the tracks, it held Charles Dickens, and it dangled over the edge. The second-class carriages behind him were enough weight to hold it on. Charles jumped into the water to try and help the survivors. If he found someone who was just barely clinging on to life, then he would hold them and tell them to take a swig of brandy. more than one person died in his arms. A total of 10 were killed in the accident, and many others were seriously injured. Just as he was helping bring the bodies out of the water, he suddenly remembered that the manuscript for his latest book, Our Mutual Friend, was still inside of the train car. He risked his life to go inside and retrieve it before it went over the edge. For the rest of Charles Dickens's life, he avoided traveling, and getting on a train gave him extreme anxiety. For years, no one knew about Charles Dickens's secret relationship because Ellen Ternan had burned most of their letters. Eventually, historians, though, they began to piece together the evidence. A movie about Ellen Ternan's life and relationship to Dickens was made in 2012 and was called The Invisible Woman. After the accident, Dickens's health was suffering. In 1867, he was given the opportunity to go on another speaking tour in America. They offered him £20,000 after expenses. This is nearly £1 million in today's money. He was still suffering from a lot of travel anxiety, and he potentially had PTSD, but Dickens felt that he could not say no to that kind of money. But when he returned, it was clear to everyone that his health had seriously declined. In 1870, Charles Dickens had a stroke, and he died unexpectedly at his home at Gads Place. He was 58 years old and had believed that he would have lived a much longer life. Dickens worked up until the day he died, and the last novel that he had been working on was called Edwin Drood, which involved a murder mystery. He died before revealing the end, which caused his fans to debate for years over what the true ending must have been. When he died, his estate was worth £93,000, which is close to £4 million today. In his will, he stated that he wanted a very quiet and private funeral in Rochester. However, this sparked a debate because many people wanted to pay their respect, so his family decided to allow him to be buried in Westminster Abbey. In the days following his death, crowds of people showed up to pay their respects to his open casket. There were so many flowers laid on top of him that no one could see him anymore. Even though he is gone, the legacy that Charles Dickens left behind, it will last forever. Today's work is read and analysed in schools all over the world. Oliver Twist was made into a movie called Oliver, and there are dozens of film adaptations of his stories. Every December, families all over the globe revisit the stories of Bob Cratchit and Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. There is almost no proper way to end a video about a man who has accomplished so much. But what if we read a few of his own words? He once said, "Whatever I have tried to do in life, I have tried with all my heart to do it well. Whatever I have devoted myself to, I have devoted myself completely. In great aims and in small, I have always thoroughly been in earnest." So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, you know what to do. Smash that like button below and don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos 4 times a week, Monday through Thursday, so please do subscribe and you'll find out all about those, but only if you click the bell button, because that's how YouTube works. And as always, thank you for watching.